Hello, and welcome to the Stone Soup Group's Family Learning Series on compensatory education for FAPE denials related to pandemic responses during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is part 4, which is the implementation of the IEP. I'm Ann Applegate. I'm a consultant, and the Stone Soup Group is the Parent Training and Information Center for Alaska. They wanted to create a family series on compensatory education for some of the difficulties that families and students experienced during the school closures and the return to school in the last several years in Alaska. This series is funded by a grant from the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority. And we have had series topics of 1 through 3 already. The first was an overview of compensatory education and a discussion about some general ideas around where it might arise and also how actually compensatory education can be quantified. We also talked in part 2 about the identification of students with disabilities, child find programs and plans that districts and the state have, and evaluations. In part 3, we talked about the requirements for IEP development and also for amending and revising IEPs. This today will be about the implementation and also include some information about least restrictive environment in placements in the IEP. And yes, you are here. Part 5 is going to be some wrap up about some frequently asked questions overall, and then we're going to talk about ideas for dispute resolution and remedies. And the recordings for the Stone Soup Group website, there's the link. They will be available all in one place. And then I think we're going to do a follow-up live streamed and not recorded question and answer period. So I want to start by a little bit of review about comp ed, which is what we call compensatory education when we're in a hurry. But compensatory education is the legal remedy that's used to make up for services that should have been provided to a student, but were not, or when services don't provide a free, appropriate public education, which is shortened to the acronym FAPE. Those kinds of remedies are awarded when services that were on the IEP weren't provided. It can also be awarded for services that should have been on the IEP and weren't. The purpose of comp ed is to put the child in the position they would be in if the district had provided the appropriate services in the first place. So it is not punitive. It's not to penalize anyone and or to say that anybody has intentionally acted against the child, but it's designed to help the child regain a lost opportunity for education, to acquire missed skills, or to get services that were dropped. And it's important to remember that compensatory education is not the same as extended school year services. Now, some examples of when comp ed might be due. We have talked about the violation of child find, the failure to identify a child that experiences disabilities in school would give rise to that lost opportunity for education, because the school and the state both have a responsibility to find all children with disability within their boundaries of authority. They have to locate them, evaluate them, and provide them with that FAPE, that free, appropriate public education, in a timely manner. There's also the failure to convene annual reviews of the IEP. There are all kinds of important procedural safeguards, and there are some that are so important that they are automatically a denial of FAPE because without them, there's no way that the district could be providing a free, appropriate public education. There's also a failure to offer an appropriate IEP. That's if the IEP isn't adequate in some of its services, or if the evaluations haven't been complete, so we don't have a full picture of that child or student. And then, of course, there's the failure to implement an appropriate IEP. That's if an IEP was written that in a way that reflects the child's needs and provides services and supports and accommodations that are going to help that student grow and learn. But there's a problem with implementing it. The delivery of services isn't what is in the IEP. When you have the failure to implement, and that gives rise to comp ed, it's likely to occur in particular kinds of circumstances, usually when the school district knew or should have known, which is really the standard, a student's IEP implementation didn't provide that FAPE, then comp ed, so long as it's material, meaning that there is an obvious missed opportunity, there is a loss of progress. There will be a reasonable time for the school district to correct a deficiency if it's something that they wouldn't reasonably have known or if they didn't know. Now, when a student's IEP is not fully implemented, then that would also obviously be a failure to implement. And that comes up in the context of COVID-19 closures and virtual delivery of education. Also, when a school district stops providing any IEP services to a student, and again, that's what happened for a lot of students and families in the last few years. I want to start with the U.S. Department of Education's guidance, which there were several very extensive documents that were written, and we've had those in 2 of our past topic discussions. So I'm not going to go over them again, but I do want to talk a minute about what they said with regard to implementation of IEPs during the physical school closures. And I've sort of summarized it because in the other slides, I've given a lot more detail. Students should continue to receive their IEP services, is what the Department of Education said. That schools can consider different options for delivering the services, online or virtual instruction, instructional telephone calls, or other kinds of curriculum-based instructional activities. They could also provide consultation time for caregivers like parents and other family members, as they are the ones that were currently then providing instruction in the home. And that after schools physically reopen, those students may be entitled to compensatory services for the services that were not provided while schools were physically closed. Some of the failures that we heard of from parents and that you can see now in some of the cases that are being published, and also the hearing decisions that are made from state due process hearings and state complaint corrective actions. And they're consistent and they're commonly shared among the experiences of parents all over. But before I start this part, I want to first say that we want to recognize that educators were working hard to keep students safe, that they were trying to protect themselves and their own families. Some of them had parents who had special vulnerability. Everyone was doing their best during the pandemic. And what I want to point out is that rightfully, given the importance of education for students with disabilities, under the IDEA, it didn't matter if the district wouldn't, or really they just simply couldn't provide FAPE. That the IDEA doesn't pay attention to fault or intention with regard to lost opportunity for education for kids with disabilities. So here are some of the failures that showed up, and we're going to be talking about these through the rest of this slide presentation. First, of course, virtual learning difficulties. Parents reported a lot of difficulty for students with IEPs to access their goals and objectives and their learning during virtual delivery. With the return to classrooms, there was a period with distanced learning, or there was hybrid learning where some students were in the classrooms and some were doing virtual learning, or there was revolving learning where different groups of kids were getting learning on site in classrooms at different times. But distance learning in classrooms and schools posed a lot of special difficulty for kids with IEPs. The pandemic created staff shortages and the unavailability of staff as well. A lot of teachers retired during COVID, and a lot of teachers decided to change careers. We also had paraeducators, aides, that decided not to work or were sick and couldn't work. So all of those kinds of circumstances, because of the way that staffing is done for special education students, those students were hit especially hard during the COVID pandemic. The lack of availability of specialists, particularly in Alaska, our state, a lot of rural schools have what are called itinerant specialists. They fly in from, some of them fly in from out of state, and they have contracts with rural school districts, and they'll do a tour of 2 months, and they'll stop in all of their villages and their smaller community schools and do what they do as specialists, do some evaluation, supervise teachers about how to implement whatever the specialist's area is, and then they move on. And so specialists during the pandemic did not come to Alaska. So there was a huge lack of availability of speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and also behavior specialists. Now, as we had the return to school with the decreased staff and the lack of availability for specialists, what we found was the least restrictive environment has become a challenge. That there's been merged learning environments and also increased segregation of students with disabilities apart from their non-disabled peers. And you can see it in the annual reporting for lots of school districts in Alaska, where they have to report how much time students with IEPs spend in environments that are not the general education classroom. And you can see across the state that that time has increased and the number has increased. So, starting back at the beginning, virtual instruction and comp ed. So the district could be providing all of the IEP services, the accommodations, and the modifications virtually, but oftentimes some or all of that service provision was just not appropriate for that individual student, because primarily, an example of having a student that could only attend to 1 or 2 step sequences, or a student that requires frequent movement breaks, or does a lot of stimming, which is a lot of repeat movement that breaks into their opportunity to access online learning. For students who couldn't manage to attend to the instruction virtually and respond to a computer-based program in a fast enough way, or in a way that was going to allow them to access the instruction, those students, it didn't matter that the district was providing the services, that there was an instructor on the other end. Those students were just getting either some or all of their opportunity essentially taken away from them because they couldn't access it. And repeatedly throughout the country, there are state complaints, corrective action decisions, and also due process hearing decisions that are saying that those students are entitled to compensatory education for whatever services weren't appropriate for that kind of delivery, especially for that kind of disability or that individual student. The U.S. Department of Ed stressed in that circumstance was that districts must consult with parents on how to best ensure that the students had necessary supports in order to get what they called, quote, equally effective access to virtual programs. Now, what that looks like in practice is something for the IEP team to have decided. Does that mean more instruction for the people that are going to be right next to that student? Does that mean an additional amount of time to make sure that they are really getting the information? Or does it mean having them on site in a special place that's safe with access to an aid? One of the things was that also stressed by the U.S. Department of Ed was that virtual programs also had to be consistent with state requirements for special ed students as well. So anything that was a state standard for in-person instruction, like the length of day or curriculum standards, those were all going to be part of what had to happen for a student. Because the IDEA has a requirement that they also progress in the regular curriculum. And so the U.S. Department of Ed was emphasizing that that's also something that IEP teams should be considering. Now, one of the things that was also a problem, besides just virtual learning as a difficult method for some students, was the consequence, which was resistance to virtual learning, which is an implementation problem. And we heard from a lot of parents about this. And in one hearing officer, not in Alaska, found that a school district failed to implement an IEP and failed to reconvene an IEP team to address challenges of remote learning for a fifth grader with ADHD who experienced a lot of difficulty attending to the method, to the learning online, and pushed back on parents trying to help, a lot of difficulty. And so what the hearing officer said was that this was an implementation problem, because distance learning for this student's IEP goals was clearly related to the difficulty of accessing because of disability. The district also didn't convene the IEP team to consider changes. And the court stressed that at the very basic level of implementation, the district had an obligation to just consider whether there was another delivery method or to develop a plan to try to address the behaviors, some kind of support for the parent who is assisting in the virtual learning. And that the failure to address the student's lack of engagement amounted to a denial of FAPE. And that student was entitled to comp ed for the entire IEP for the period of virtual learning. The hearing officer felt like that student didn't get any education in that time period. A different hearing officer found that another student, and this was an older student, had that student's school refusal. It was just a refusal to even turn on the computer, and sometimes to just not even get out of the bed. That refusal was not part of the existing diagnosis and information that the district had about the student, but that refusal was linked by previous evaluations to the diagnosis, which was more related to an inconsistency of engagement in class that was connected to an emotional disturbance disability. So the district, in the opinion of the hearing officer, should have convened the team to evaluate it further and discuss the results of the evaluations and consider whether the school refusal was linked, was caused or was related to the existing emotional disturbance. The lesson that I get out of these cases, having looked at several of them, is that every officer wants to see that there was at least an IEP team meeting convened to discuss what happens next, to figure out a plan, if it is related to disability, if it is a barrier to getting IEP goals implemented, and that the student can't access or make any progress, that the IEP team has an obligation to start to try to plan for that and create some other kind of support, continue to work on that as an implementation problem. And this school district actually did have some interventions, but didn't do it in a timely way. And that was also part of that case. Another issue that arose with implementation of the IEP during COVID pandemic was the question of who is implementing the IEP. We've talked about that some with regard to parents implementing the IEP, but the other problem was that there were educators and paraeducators who were not always qualified for the services that they were providing. The IDEA requires that the IEP have a statement of who's going to be providing what kinds of services for how many minutes, what the frequency is, and for how long a period of time, what's the location. And it also requires that everybody do something they're qualified to do. So special educators can deliver modified curriculum and specialized instruction, and paraeducators can work with that educator for implementation, for practice, for they can help with while an educator is measuring, they can be working on the skill themselves. So that's for special education. For speech language or occupational therapy or physical therapy, those have to be certified specialists, right? That provide that service. Now, special educators can provide services under those categories so long as they are being supervised by a specialist. So the specialist creates the program, helps the educator understand what the tasks are going to be and what they should be taking data on, and then reports it back to that specialist. Now, throughout the pandemic, when we had no specialists to deliver services or a lack of availability of those specialists, we had educators who were providing unsupervised related services. We also had paraeducators who were filling in, who were taking care of other classes' students they were not trained on those specific students' IEPs. Again, everybody was trying to do their best. So it's not about fault. It's just that they weren't qualified. And under the IDEA, if someone isn't qualified to provide the service that they've provided, then it doesn't count as provision. It hasn't happened really. And of course, when parents were the paraeducator, were the behavior support, were the teachers, those services provided by parents were also not considered to have been provided. So in both those instances, that would be a failure to implement the IEP. So those things might well give rise to a comp ed claim. Now, there are cases, of a lot of them actually, on staffing and qualifications across the country. So again, these are due process hearing decisions and also state complaint corrective action letters or reports. One hearing officer uh, said that the speech language pathologist who created a packet that was then done with parents was not the same as 30 minutes of speech language services. That's just really pretty clear. It certainly was created by the SLP, and I'm pretty sure that somebody tried to tell that teacher, I mean that parent, what to do with that packet. But that doesn't matter because a parent isn't a specialist in speech language services. In another packet case, students with disabilities across the learning environment got work packets with no accompanying teacher-led instruction during COVID. They were given these packets, and then the packets were supposedly designed for anyone to be able to look at them and help the student do it. So it was clearly no special education instruction from a specialist. The judge in that case, and that was a court case, said work packets with no scheduled interaction with any teacher do not constitute specialized instruction. And that specialized instruction is the first part of the definition of special ed. This is also a court case. It was affirming a lower decision by a due process hearing officer. And the court said that it was a denial of FAPE because there was a lack of a PCA, that's a personal care assistant, at home. This student evidently in their IEP had a PCA at school. I'm sure it was probably for a PCA usually provides assistance to living. So maybe with toileting or making sure that someone has mobility help. So the court said that there was no FAPE because the PCA was not provided at home, and said that regardless of the state guidance about safety, that was not FAPE because the student just couldn't access their learning without the assistance of this PCA. And the court then concluded that from the time that the classes went virtual, that student's IEP was just no longer reasonably calculated to enable him to make appropriate progress. That's that Andrews standard. Here's an outlier. There was another court that held that an IEP that included nurse care for medical needs at school, needs that were met at home by parents, didn't require providing that nurse to provide that during virtual learning for school closures. So FAPE was given because it was insulin shots, and parents did that at home during the regular school year. So it didn't interfere with the access to virtual learning to not have a nurse doing the insulin shots at home. So we've talked a little bit about that chart or the statement of services delivered. The hours of instruction not being implemented are the hours that are on that chart. During COVID, we saw education being shortened by days of the week, or also by shortened days, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. Revolving schedules. There were students who had short days, some days, and longer days, other days. There were also gaps between the revolving schedules. So some students were in for 2 days a week, 1 week, and 3 days a week the next week because of having to have fewer students in the classroom for distancing. Of course, there were also things that weren't planned for, like teacher illnesses or even exposures in a given classroom, and suddenly that part of the building was not going to be available for students to learn in. And if there were exposures that got kids sick, or that just exposed peers potentially to spreading the illness to other people. There is a services chart in Alaska. This is a part of that statement under the IDEA section 300.320 sub A. And the reason I point out that it is part of the statement is this is our page. I copied it and put it on here as a little picture. And you can see at the top, it's called Guidance for Special Education Personnel. And I just want to stress that there's nothing in the IDA section 300.320 sub A that says that this is guidance. It is the statement of services to be provided. It's also not guidance for the special education personnel. I mean, maybe that's a title of the volume, but it does make it look like that's what this form has on it when it's given out to educators. So I'm not sure. What I want to make sure that you understand is the categories here are what should be provided. If the minutes say 90, the sessions per week is 1. The period of time that it's going to be done is between the whole school year, and the primary provider is the special education teacher. If it's something that needs to be supervised, you can see right below there, it says frequency of supervision and supervised by. The location is something that's got to be in there. Special or regular, but they also have other divisions too for that location. Other identifiers are available. The service area, that's the kind of area of need, like speech or math or behavior or social emotional learning. And the goal is which number it's associated with in the IEP. So this chart, if there are minutes down here on the side, this right second column in from the right side, and they were not provided within that area, then that will be a failure to implement. Whether or not that arises to the level of material, like an impact that is observable, that shows that there was a lost opportunity to learn, there's a failure to progress, then that may well give rise to a comp ed claim. Again, services dropped, time shortened, frequency reduced. Now, where you are most likely to see this through COVID is in related services, adaptive physical education, which is a very important area. People think because it's PE, it's less significant than some of the other areas, but adaptive physical education is very important to a lot of students with IEPs. What they call life skills or adaptive skills, a lot of transitions to adulthood planning and the service delivery were compromised during COVID. Also behavior skills and supports. So those are the places that you're most likely to see the kind of hours of instruction not being implemented. Instruction, when it's given virtually, but it's still, the IEP isn't implemented. So we're going to continue with that theme. But here are some other examples. One is if the school setting is part of learning the skill. If it's in the goals and objectives in the IEP, specifically that the school setting is going to be where the skill gets acquired, where it's going to be measured, then it doesn't matter if they've tried to give instruction virtually on it. It's likely that it's not going to be considered an implementation of the IEP. And there are some obvious examples. One of them you see a lot is social emotional learning that requires peers. So that students are going to interact in a particular way among their peers, and that they're going to measure that through contact with peers. It's very difficult, as you can imagine, to create real instruction virtually for that goal. Lots of students who have life skills goals have access to specialized rooms with specialized equipment, whether they're appliances that are designed to be something that is accommodating. They have specialized AT, assistive technology, in rooms that are designed to teach skills for independence in adulthood. So those kinds of things, access to that particular kind of specialized equipment, that's not going to be implemented virtually. Something that used to see a lot is swimming and access to locker rooms as a part of a goal, because of course swimming and water safety, drown proofing is a safety skill, but also learning to do transfers, in and out of the pool transfer, or transferring from an electric wheelchair to a sport wheelchair. Also, life skills like showering. It's a really easy place to have an aid helping a student learning sort of proper showering, because they can shower with the suit on, and because it's semi-public, and so it's considered sort of safer. But also dressing with assistance, same thing. Again, going back to the adaptive physical education, most APE requires specialized equipment and access to a large gym. You know, to have a hand-pedaled bicycle or a trike that's large and very stable. There are other kinds of equipment that is about sort of balance and lifting progressively larger objects and being able to bend and hold. And proprioception is super important. And it's something that lots of students need specialized instruction for. And that happens a lot in APE. It's related to, physical therapy, but it's the kind of activity that requires specialized equipment and a large gym, and that's not going to happen virtually. Other things that are only available in the school or are needed for learning. We saw about nurse for medical assistance. That can happen during transfers. Also interpreters, not just for language, but for idiosyncratic speech. Having an interpreter while someone is learning is often important. Braille. Parents often don't know Braille, even though their student is learning Braille. We moved to schools, and instruction was being given in schools, but there were lots of instances where the IEP was still not being implemented. And again, that's because we were trying to be distanced. Nobody was at fault. We were all following the safety requirements, but lots of IEP goals require close contact for learning the skill as it's written in the goal and the objective, but the learning had to be distanced. So some examples are where you see hand over hand. Let's see, student learning assistive technology, whether it's learning software on an iPad for communication, or whether it's something larger, but still needs to be demonstrated and practiced and redirected or corrected. Also, students with visual impairment or blindness, a lot of their learning is about hands-on. And also mobility training, and that's going to require some close contact. So those things, if you are thinking about an IEP and whether or not it was implemented for your student, if you see those kinds of things in that IEP, really question whether or not that was delivered, that service was delivered. Speech, another really good example of having the need to observe and also intervene physically for motor skills and for articulation for speech. There's a lot of tools that are very up close. You're looking at little dental mirrors to make sure that you're looking behind the front row of teeth while a student is placing the tongue for making a sound. That's very close contact. And that didn't happen when we were only able to educate students 6 feet apart. There was a case, actually, that a judge said that teletherapy was not in the IEP, and that the speech language pathologist this particular SLP was not trained in the method of delivery through teletherapy. So the time with that SLP in teletherapy was not a free, appropriate public education for this one student. The other thing, of course, is behavior support and interventions, and also in the moment social emotional learning. That kind of support or intervening is often in close contact. So again, if that's part of an IEP that you're thinking about and wondering whether or not it was implemented, do a little checking in, look at some of the progress notes, see what was happening for that particular goal. And if the loss was material, then these would be likely to give rise to some comp ed claims. What I'd like to do is move on to the least restrictive environment as a concept, and also to get you thinking about the entire package of placement, that suite of services, and whether it was being offered in the least restrictive environment. LRE is the shortened acronym for least restrictive environment. It's a very important aspect of IEP implementation. And remember, as we said before, a couple of different topic sessions, we said that reminded people that placement is not a place. It's a suite of services. It is the environment is relevant only because it has stuff in it that is appropriate for learning for a particular individual student. But it includes all of the accommodations that are there. It includes the type of qualifications of the people that are educating. It includes what kinds of modifications are made to policies. It includes all of the time, the various time with various specialists. That is what placement is. And we describe it in particular ways that sound like places, but really it's about the collection of services that are offered, and they should be offered in the least restrictive environment. That means that students with disabilities receive their education as close to or alongside their peers without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. It's not about having their movement restricted. It's a different use of that word. What it means is, where would the student be but for their disability? What kind of place would they be learning in? And how close can we get them to that place? And I think of it as the experience and the presence of non-disabled peers. So that means that students should not be removed from the general education classroom unless learning cannot be achieved. And the law says, even with the use of supplementary aids and services. So supplementary aids and services, those are aids and services and any other support that are provided in a regular education classroom, in other education settings, in extracurricular or non-academic settings that are intended to enable the child with a disability to be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. And the plan is to enable the student to make progress toward their academic or functional goals, to be involved and make progress in the general education curriculum, to participate in the extracurricular activities like drama club or chess club, or other non-academic activities like attending a dance or going to a football game, and that they would take part in these activities with and without students with disabilities. Now, the factors to consider for placement are right here in this big long slide. Individualization, that it be based on the student's unique needs and goals and taking into account the parent and student preferences, that they benefit the student and not just academics, but the behavioral, functional, and social emotional benefits of being with peers and also being educated in environments that work well for them. Effect on peers is one of the considerations, and that's because the state has an obligation to teach all kids. The effect of the student's presence, because they can be favorable and also less favorable. It's good for classrooms to be diverse. And there's also can be impacts on instructional time if there aren't sufficient supports and the right kinds of services provided in that general education classroom. They call it the appropriateness and inclusion as a balance. And I think that it's more about saying whether or not there is a practical way to provide the supports and services that are going to work in the spaces in which the student will result from, the student will get progress. So the question is, being educated with students without disabilities, is the environment going to be good for the student with a disability? Is it going to support the larger goal of making our spaces inclusive of all kinds of difference? Now, the use of supplementary aids and services are, have to do not just with education, also with accommodations or modifications. They can be about extending time or modifying assignments, anything that can support the student in that environment. Part of the least restrictive environment puzzle is that in order to get a student into the least restrictive environment, there has to be a range of educational placements that are going to offer a variety of levels of support. And so there's the continuum of alternate placement is what it's called, where an IEP can be implemented to meet the individual needs of students with disabilities. Now, those range from the least restrictive setting, which is, the general education classroom, to what would be considered the most restrictive ones, like a hospital or a residential facility. And actually, at home is also considered in that same category of most restrictive because it's distance from the experience and presence of non-disabled peers. So home is just as far away from that as a hospital is. The IDEA requires that districts create this continuum for all the students through all the district. Now, if the district has created that continuum, then the IEP team should be considering the full range of options that might be appropriate based on the individual needs of the student and the environment in which that student will most likely progress. But most importantly, and the thing that I want to make sure that I stress for you post-COVID is that the IEP team has to document the reasons that the student services are not being delivered in the general education classroom. And they have to document any reasons for changing that placement. So if anything happened either during the COVID pandemic response or subsequently that has resulted in a change of placement for your student, make sure that that document, that IEP document, reflects that there was a full consideration of the range of options and what would be the best place for the student and what it would require to get them there, and then an explanation for the reasons why they're not in a general ed classroom or why there was a change in placement. This video, we talked about some of the difficulties that are common around the country with IEP implementation during COVID and how, they might be considered for compensatory education claims. We talked a bit about materiality. We talked about what kinds of things you might see in your own student's IEP. I try to give a lot of examples so that it'll jog your memory and also your curiosity about what was happening for your student as compared to what was written in that IEP. So the next topic is going to be, again, I said dispute resolution. We're going to talk about low-level conflict, how to write the right kind of letter that starts the discussion, what kinds of things you can do to prepare for a possible escalation of conflict, even while you're being uh, even while you're being faced with growing anxiety in the school and in your own family over the changes that are happening. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about some of the frequently asked questions that have come up. We've been creating lists. I've been creating lists of FAQs from around the country and also getting some that we had coming in to us here in Alaska. So that's the next topic. But until then, what I'd really like you to do, if you can, take an hour and think about whether your student's IEP was fully implemented during the pandemic and also in the period after. And think about what the least restrictive environment is for your student. I think thinking creatively for a minute or two about what would it require for your student to be in their best place. And ask if there's been a change of placement since the return to school. And if so, why? And is that in the IEP? And also, what does the continuum of alternate placements look like in your school or even in your district? And are there supports and services that would help your student to benefit from a less restrictive placement? Could they spend a little more time in the general education classroom, even if it's 10 more minutes a day? Are there places where it would be a nice natural fit for them to join in for out loud reading or to join in with something else that they love to do and would enjoy doing with their non-disabled peers? That's just an example, but think about it. What would it take? What kinds of supports would it take? First of all, I want to say thank you. These go a lot faster when there are no people talking back to me in the moment, but I'm looking forward to hearing from questions later. I want to say thanks to the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority and also to Stone Soup Group. And I look forward, hopefully, to talking with you all later. Thanks.